It is Friday, March 16th, 2018. My name is Ashton Ellett, here with another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. I'm here at Denton's Law Firm in Atlanta, Georgia, and joining me is Ambassador Gordon Giffen. Mr. Giffen is currently a senior partner and member of the Global and U.S. Board of Directors at Denton's, where he also leads the Public Policy Group and co-leads its energy sector. He is also chairman of the board of directors for TransAlta, one of Canada's leading energy providers. Mr. Giffen is also the former United States ambassador to Canada, serving in that capacity from August 1997 until April 2001. Prior to that, Mr. Giffen served as a close aide and confidant to United States Senator Sam Nunn, and he remains active in Georgia politics to the present day. Thank you very much for taking time out of your schedule on this Friday, Mr. Giffen. I was wondering if we could begin by talking a little bit about your childhood and your upbringing.
Sure. Well, it's not particularly relevant to Georgia, but I was born in Massachusetts and moved to Montreal, Canada when I was 6 weeks old. My father had been born in Canada, and his company, New York Life Insurance, moved him back to Canada in order to take advantage of his heritage in Canada in their business. I went through 7th grade in Montreal, and then we moved to Toronto, where I finished high school. And I came south from high school in Canada. I went to Duke University in North Carolina and fell in love with the South and decided that I wanted to remain in the South, but didn't want to stay in Durham, North Carolina for another 3 years. And so I looked around the South for a law school in a metropolitan area. Emory stood out. I applied to Emory and got into Emory Law School. And that began my association in 1971 with Georgia.
Were you raised in a particularly political family? Were you interested in politics at a young age? So many of the people I talk to are. Was that the case with you?
Well, I was interested in politics and government and history, actually. As a youngster, I read historical biographies all the time. For some reason, that fascinated
Sure.
me. And largely, even though I was living in Canada and frankly had lived there from age 6 weeks, I still was interested in U.S. political and historical figures and read a lot about it. My father was interested in government and politics, but not active.
Right.
We'd talk about it at the dinner table, that sort of thing, but at a very high level. He wasn't into the granular aspects. For some reason, it was just government, politics, policy, public policy always fascinated me.
Is that what took you to Duke University? Your academic interests were those also historical, legal, political?
Well, at Duke, I majored in history and political science, which obviously was consistent with those interests.
Right.
I also thought those were good groundings for ultimately a study of law, and I had always intended to be a lawyer, but I think knew intuitively that the law is part of the public policy process, and so the more you understood history, political science, combined it with a legal education, that you could contribute to the policy dynamic.
So you were on Duke's campus. So you were in Raleigh-Durham from 67 to 71.
Correct.
Pretty active period in terms of social and political ferment.
Yes. Yep.
Was that something you got involved in, or were you an observer of that?
I was more of, I guess, an interested observer. No, I wasn't a protester, and so I was more one of the people. And a university or a university campus is a fascinating place to be in times of unrest, because there's a lot of intellectual stimulation to the whole thing, and debate, analysis, and so Duke for a southern university was probably a liberal campus. I say that in a relative sense. It really wasn't liberal, but but more so than, say, NC State, which was next door. And so being there during, you're right, I mean, it was during the Vietnam War. It was during the period where Martin Luther King was assassinated, where Robert Kennedy was assassinated. It was an intriguing time to be on a college campus because of the stimulation of argument, debate, protest.
So you go from Raleigh-Durham to suburban Atlanta, Emory, East Atlanta, Druid Hills. What was your primary interest in law school? What kind of attorney, what kind of lawyer?
I had no idea.
No idea?
I was hoping that as my studies progressed, that would become clear. I knew I wanted to be a lawyer. Most people, at least when I was in law school, thought they wanted to be litigators because they watched Perry Mason or movies about people in trials. I really honestly had no particular discipline within the law in mind.
So how, and you would have left law school in '74.
Yes.
Thereabout. How did you get involved in politics?
Yeah, it's a good question. While I was in school, and one of the reasons I wanted to go to school in a metropolitan area, I sought and obtained part-time work in a law firm. And I went to work for a law firm in Decatur, which was then the largest law firm in DeKalb County, McCurdy, Candler, and Harris. The Harris in that firm was Robin Harris, who had been one of the more distinguished members of the Georgia legislature in the 60s. And I guess in the 60s, he had chaired the House Judiciary Committee and was one of the more thoughtful, cerebral people who ever served in the Georgia legislature. And I was exposed to him in the law firm. Now, I will say that when I was in law school, I didn't do a whole lot of substantive work in the law firm. I was a glorified errand boy in many respects, or searching titles and doing things of that nature, and just learning the mechanics of law practice. But I spent a good deal of time talking to Mr. Harris, and he educated me about an awful lot of the history of Georgia politics, the evolution of government policy in the legislative context, and I sort of learned at his knee just through casual conversation. Anytime I had spare time and it didn't look like he was busy, I'd go nag him about some other aspect of the evolution of governance in Georgia. And at one point, I noticed on the bulletin board at Emory Law School, I noticed that the newly elected United States Senator from Georgia, Sam Nunn, was initiating a new internship program in his office. And unlike most internship programs, it was something that would be selected by the Institute of Government at the University of Georgia. It wasn't necessarily children of friends and
the old patronage
and
boy
large contributors. He reserved the summer internships for more political choices, and I noticed that, and I thought to myself, well, I'm not from Georgia, so the odds of getting selected are probably remote, but the fact that it's being handled by a faculty as opposed to political operatives might give me a shot at it. And I asked Mr. Harris about it, and he said, absolutely, you should apply. And because Sam Nunn had served in the Georgia legislature in the 60s and had been on the House Judiciary Committee, and Mr. Harris had gotten to know him quite well, and in some measure had mentored him, he was extraordinarily complimentary of Sam Nunn, who I had never met at that point. And so I applied for that internship and went through the interview process, and lo and behold, got selected as the first law student. He wanted 1 law student, 3 college students, or the program defined it to be that
Right.
way. And so I was in the first class, if you will, and was the first law student in the internship program to go up to Washington. So the middle quarter, second quarter of my 3rd year of law school, I took off from the law school and went there for a quarter with an arrangement with the law school that I'd do legal research and writing while I was in Washington to get the credits necessary to graduate, which I did. And I returned, finished my 3rd quarter at the law school, graduated, went to work in Decatur for the McCurdy, Candler and Harris law firm. About 6 months later, Senator Nunn called me and asked me if I wanted to come back to Washington and be his chief counsel and legislative director, which at the outset I indicated I didn't want to do, that I had gone to law school to learn how to practice law, and now I was at a point where I could actually earn a living, and I didn't want to run off. And so, but long story, he persisted, and I ended up in January of '75 beginning as a full-time staff member in his office.
What were your first impressions of Senator Nunn when you met him as a law student?
Enormously impressed. He was probably 35 years old when I met him, but he was a 55-year-old, 35-year-old. He was mature, thoughtful, and by thoughtful I mean he would always think something through before he started talking about it. Consummately intelligent. You could see the wheels grinding behind his glasses. Quite demanding. If he asked you to produce some thinking memoranda, that sort of thing, if it wasn't a quality piece of work, he was quick to point out where the flaws were and what you should have thought about. So in every respect, I was enormously impressed. When you go to an office like that as a young person, you don't know what you're going to find.
Sure.
You're going to find, in a sense, a good old boy who's, there and not up to the job but got elected, or in this case, a stunningly talented young man who I think was on the cutting edge of helping to evolve the South into its rightful equal place in the dynamic of the country.
So you were director of legislative affairs and general counsel, but,
Yes.
but legislative affairs, was that mainly dealing with armed services legislation?
No, actually, it mainly wasn't. I
Okay.
had responsibility for all of the legislative and policy work that he was involved with, other than the military work. He had others on the staff, and that component grew over time as his seniority grew. But no, I didn't handle the Armed Services Committee work.
So what sort of policies was Senator Nunn interested in as a young, first term, early second term senator?
Well, an array of issues, local things like we spent a lot of time in those early years focused on preserving the Chattahoochee River National Recreation. We created the Chattahoochee River National Recreation Area, preserving area around the river so it could be used as a natural habitat forever. worked in tandem with Ellett on the House side in order to pass legislation to accomplish that. We did things like, I'll never forget, Governor Busby's staff got us involved in an effort to change the formula by which water and sewer grants were made by the federal government, which, I mean, that was basically money coming to your state to be able to fund infrastructure for the growth and development of the state, and in this case, largely metropolitan Atlanta. The manner in which that money was allocated was in the law. And Busby's staff, to their credit, came up with a theory by which we could change that formula that would allocate more money to the state of Georgia than had previously been the case. We put together an enormous coalition, because it turned out that would be true for states like Utah and Montana. And so we cobbled together a remarkable coalition, Democrats and Republicans.
Sure.
And changed the formula. And now New York and California were mad about it because it wasn't creating more money, it was moving it around. And so his interest was both local and more national and international. One of the early priorities that he put me on was the Voting Rights Act was about to expire. It was enacted in 1964 and had a 10-year sunset clause in it. And there was to be a meaningful debate in the United States Senate about whether or not to extend the Voting Rights Act. And one of the first things he said to me when I got in that office, he said, I want you to spend every spare moment you have studying the history of the Voting Rights Act, studying the mechanics of the Voting Rights Act. When that comes up on the floor of the Senate, I want to participate in a meaningful, constructive way. And so I did an enormous amount of work on that. And he ended up offering 2 amendments as that was considered. One was to expand the coverage of the Voting Rights Act nationwide, because people forget it didn't cover the whole country. It fundamentally covered the states of the old Confederacy. And at that time, there was clear difficulty in places like Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles, with minority registration and participation.
Right.
And there was just not a good intellectually grounded argument to say it shouldn't apply in places other than the South. So he offered an amendment to expand it nationwide. And he offered one that would have created what I call a kick-out clause, meaning if over a period of time a state, in this case Georgia, demonstrated that it got it right, that there was a high level of minority registration and participation.
Right.
That they could get out from, that state could get out from some of the procedural requirements, not substantive requirements, meaning you can't slide back on voter participation, but the pre-clearance requirement, for example, every time you moved a voting precinct location,
Right.
You had to get Justice Department approval. Well, to go to Washington to, move the voting box from Margaret Mitchell School to the library, gets a little onerous and unnecessary.
Sure.
And so we developed some metrics that I forget whether it was over a period of 5 years or how long it was, that you were exceeding the national average in minority registration and participation. And Georgia, by that time, was way ahead of the national average.
Right.
Georgia had gotten it right. Both those amendments were defeated by 2 or 3 votes. And it was fascinating. They were opposed by some of the great liberals in the Senate. Ted Kennedy opposed it. John Tunney from California, I remember, opposed expanding it nationwide, expanding or providing for the kick-out clause. I started to question the motives at that point of some of the people that seemed to argue that they were for minority participation when they weren't willing to have their state covered. So we lost by a narrow margin on those two votes, but yet Sam Nunn in the final analysis became the first Georgia senator to vote for civil rights legislation. He voted for final passage of the extension of the Voting Rights Act, which I think was isn't recognized generally, but that was a historic moment for the state of Georgia when a U.S. senator from Georgia voted for civil rights legislation.
Well, I think it also bears mentioning that had Senator Nunn's amendments been adopted in 75, 76, that would have fulfilled both of Chief Justice Roberts' concerns in the Shelby County case, that it didn't apply nationwide and that there was no way to get out from underneath the pre-clearance issues, which is, in the end, what were gutted from the Voting Rights Act. So,
and we weren't trying to take out pre-clearance.
Right.
We're just saying, if you're conducting yourselves appropriately under the law and under the Constitution, then you don't have to have these restrictions on you unless you fall back. And intellectually, there was no good argument against it. I will say this, it was fascinating to me, as someone who grew up in Canada, right? I had read about the Civil War and the history of the North and South and so forth, but it was all academic to me until I was sitting in the United States Senate. Back then, I guess it's still true, if you were staffing a United States senator on a particular piece of legislation, they could ask for permission for one staffer to have floor privileges. And I had a little chair that sat right behind Senator Nunn's chair. Walter Mondale was immediately to the left. And I, throughout the debate on the Voting Rights Act, I was sitting on the floor of the Senate. And to watch the dynamic where it was just absolutely clear senators from northern states thought they knew better about what should be done here. And it was a vestige, I'm telling you, of 100 years before. And it was stunning to see it in real time.
And maybe I would hazard to say that most Democrats, right, center, and left, would jump at the amendment to make the Voting Rights Act nationwide today.
Sure.
Oh, it'd be a no-brainer for Democrats today, but like you said,
it was still a very controversial piece of legislation everywhere, but certainly in the South. And there was an intellectual legitimacy to the concerns in the South. Now, there were some who had reasons to be against it, that weren't necessarily intellectually grounded. But if the point was to ensure that everybody had the right to register and could register, and everybody had the right to vote and could vote, then we were making a lot of progress. And it wasn't supposed to be punitive. It was supposed to produce those two results.
Speaking of, you mentioned Senator Nunn's vote. Senator Talmadge was still in the Senate at this time. What was the working relationship, the working dynamic between Senator Nunn's office and his colleague, Senator Talmadge, during the time you were there?
It was very collaborative. I'll speak for myself, but I went to school on the Talmadge office. I learned a lot. The staff there, Rogers Wade was the chief of staff at the time.
Right.
And Rogers, even before he was in Washington, he had been at the Georgia Chamber, and gone to the University of Georgia. Rogers had an enormous grounding in the state of Georgia and knew more people than anybody in Georgia that I knew other than Buddy Darden. Buddy Darden knew everybody in Georgia.
Still does.
Yeah, still does. And so Rogers, second only to Buddy Darden, knew everybody in Georgia. And so people like Rogers were very generous to me. I was 25 years old.
Right.
I'd lived in Georgia to the degree that I had gone to Emory Law School, for Pete's sake. That's not getting grounded in Georgia.
Right.
So people like Rogers Wade were enormously helpful to me. Senator Nunn also himself spent a lot of time draining knowledge and history from Senator Talmadge. He would ask him questions all the time, consult with him, and he was obviously using him as using, not in a pejorative way, studying from Talmadge, not agreeing with him all the time.
Sure.
But Herman Talmadge had been part of a political dynasty in the state of Georgia, and himself had been governor and been in the Senate and had gotten to the point of being a very, very senior member of the Senate, chaired a committee, agriculture, was number 2 on finance. So he had a lot of influence. And early on in my tenure on Senator Nunn's staff, I mean, my job was to, before he'd go vote on a matter, he either needed to have a memo or I needed to talk to him about the research that I had done or the staff had done, and about all the input we had received from the state of Georgia, whether it's letters, telephone calls. Back then, people sent letters.
Western Union telegrams.
Yeah. And so I would talk to him before virtually every vote, or at least give him a memo. And then I'd oftentimes go up in the staff gallery and watch the vote. Well, during those early years before he voted, he would go almost every time, not every time, but certainly on important votes. You could watch him go over and speak to Herman Talmadge. And he was drawing on Talmadge's perspective, things that happened before and that sort of thing. And I remember at one point asking him whether there was any point in my giving him any memos, because he was going to ask Talmadge anyway. And he looked at me and said, what you're doing for me is providing me enormously important input, both what I'm learning from people in the state of Georgia and objective analysis. But I have to have the historical perspective as well. I said, okay.
Fair enough.
So we learned a lot. Again, he didn't always agree with Senator Talmadge, didn't always vote the same as Senator Talmadge, but having that office there, they were right across the hall, literally. We were 110 Russell Senate Office Building, they were 109.
So you started off in public policy, working in Senator Nunn's office. How did you get involved in campaign work, fundraising? When was that?
Well, part of the responsibility I had on his staff, which he imposed on me, it wasn't my idea, he said, you need to become an expert on the campaign finance laws and the ethics laws and rules that apply to me as a
which were relatively new at that time.
Yeah, brand new, and they were changing. 1976, there was a seminal Supreme Court case on campaign finance, Buckley versus Vallejo, and the rigor of paying attention to the ethics rules and ethics laws was really just beginning.
Right.
Not that people were unethical before, but the intensity of focus on what the rules were became much more strong. And among the characteristics of Sam Nunn is integrity and honesty, and he wanted to know that I was literally an expert on anything that would apply in terms of what was proper for his conduct in a campaign context or in the office. So I jumped on it, and I believe I became one of the experts in the Senate on campaign finance and the ethics rules. And I regularly had, certainly from Talmadge's office, but regularly from other offices, inquiries to me about what was appropriate, what people could do. And there were lots of times when Senator Nunn would come back to the office and he'd say, Senator so-and-so got a problem. I've told him that you'll come over and talk to his staff and give them guidance on how to deal with it. I did a lot of that. I'll give you one short vignette. When I showed up in the office, there was this custom that the Coca-Cola company provided complimentary Coca-Cola products in every Georgia office.
Right.
So if you came in to visit Senator Nunn's office, you'd be offered some peanuts that were provided by the State Agricultural Commission, or a Coke. There wasn't the diversity of Coke products that we have today, so it was probably Coke or Diet Coke, or maybe even back then Tab. So in my studies, I concluded that that was an impermissible corporate contribution to the operation of the office. And I went to Senator Nunn and I said, you know, I know this is a Georgia company, and I know this is a nice thing to do for constituents, but I'm concerned. And he said, write me a memo. I wrote him a memo, and then he responded and he said, if this is your view, then we need to ask the company to stop providing the products. Well, I called a senior executive at the company who I didn't know, and didn't realize that I was sort of crossing the third rail of Georgia relationships, and he just began to sputter, and you know, basically said, "And tell me who you are," and but to Senator Nunn's credit, he backed me up, and we stopped the Cokes. But I realized that that was a big problem, to say that almost the landmark company in the state of Georgia that had been doing this and continued to do it in the other offices couldn't do that. So Senator Nunn actually got appointed to a special committee to rewrite the Senate Ethics Code. And he nominated me to the staff of that special committee. Well, I wrote an exemption to the Senate Ethics Code that prohibits corporate contributions for home state consumable products. That was accepted. It was passed in the Senate Ethics Code, and it was taken and put by Jack Flint from Georgia, who was chairman of the House Ethics Committee, in the House Ethics Committee. So to this day, there is an exemption in the Senate and House gift rules for the provision of home state consumable products. And by the way, that permitted Florida to have orange juice. At that time, it permitted North Carolina. They gave away cigarettes back then.
Different time.
And you know, I kept saying the guys from Kentucky ought to be giving away bourbon.
Right.
So anyway, but all of that put me in a position that when I left Senator Nunn's office and came back to Atlanta to practice law, one of the things that you got to have confidence in your ability to do something. I had never really practiced law in a big law firm. I joined what was then the largest law firm in Georgia, Hansel and Post. And my practice was largely state and federal energy and telecommunications regulations, which I was good at. But I was literally, in my mind, the best lawyer in the country on federal campaign laws and congressional ethics. Well, it turned out I got hired by a bunch of U.S. senators running for re-election, all Democrats, to be their campaign counsel, to advise them on campaign laws. I mean, my first non-Sam Nunn client was Herman Talmadge. You'll recall he had some difficulties.
Right.
And I became counsel to him and his campaign, and then went from there, where I represented a number of candidates, and then regionally in the Southeast represented the President Carter's re-election campaign. So that got me involved in the whole mechanics of campaigns, but from the role of a lawyer. And then Senator Nunn in 84 ran for re-election, and I became his campaign treasurer when I came back in 79. So I was very much involved in putting together the structure for fundraising for his re-election for the 84 campaign, and in large measure directed the mechanics of the 84 re-election campaign, which I was on the Senate staff in 78 when he ran for re-election, so I wasn't in the quote campaign, but I was sort of the liaison from the office to the campaign. In 84, 85, Senator Nunn was very involved in the formation of the Democratic Leadership Council, a moderate Democratic effort to try and recover national viability after the Mondale defeat. And he got me involved in that effort. And through that, I became much more engaged with literally people all over the country who were sort of my peers, who were sort of the senior advisor, if you will, to Bruce Babbitt, governor of, I guess, Arizona. Chuck Robb in Virginia, Al Gore in Tennessee, Bill Clinton in Arkansas. So that became a fraternity, if you will, of moderate Democrats nationally, and I got to know my peers, and then got to know Al Gore, Bill Clinton, Chuck Robb, quite personally, and so that was sort of the platform from which I got very active, and then I was very involved in the effort to attract the 1988 Democratic National Convention to Atlanta. I became counsel to the host committee, and but also because of my network was very involved in selling Atlanta. I knew most of the people on the site selection committee, and when we got the convention, I was involved on a daily basis in the preparation for the convention, the legal work related to that, but also the politics and the mechanics, and I became the deputy finance chairman of the Democratic National Committee, largely focused on financing the convention. And so that set me off on a path to be involved with the DNC. Mm-hmm. I later was counsel to Ron Brown, who became chairman of the DNC, then counsel to the 1992 Democratic National Convention Selection Committee. 96, I chaired the selection committee. So that moved me to not only have one foot in Georgia politics, but also very involved on a national level.
That's right. Yeah, I think 96 was probably the first Democratic National Convention I remember, because it was in Chicago.
Yep.
Because it was my home state, although I'm about 7 hours south of Chicago.
Well, I was the convention where I chaired the site selection committee. President Clinton asked me to do that, and I remember at one point, as we were getting the process started, he invited me to the White House, and it was actually in the residence, and he and Hillary Clinton were there, and we had a cup of coffee together, and we talked about the mechanics of doing the due diligence on what the appropriate city would be. And I remember Hillary looked at me and she said, "We want you to do a thorough, objective analysis of all the competing cities." Pause. "And when you're through with that thorough, objective analysis, I suspect you will find that Chicago probably stands out."
Well, of course, Hillary was a Chicago native.
Right.
I want to take a step back, talk about the DLC first, and then working with Bobby Kahn, Atlanta '88. After that,
Have you talked to Bobby?
I have. Always an enjoyable, fun.
Well,
discussion.
he was obviously at the center of Atlanta '88. I think. I don't know if he talked about the rest of the team, but I think it would be fair to say that he was at the center, but I was about that far away from the center.
Sure. When you talk about fundraising and running Atlanta '88 and raising money for the convention, the Atlanta business establishment at that time, firmly Democratic in state politics let's discuss that.
The Atlanta
then.
business community at the time was firmly agnostic about politics. They dealt with politics only if they had to. They would just as soon ignore it. They found it unseemly. Now, certainly at that time, we were still substantially a Democratic-controlled, if you will, state. So all things being equal, they would be seen in public with Democrats. But in terms of having any particular affinity for Democratic political leaders, not generally. Sure, they loved Sam Nunn and things of that nature, and at that time, I guess it was Joe Frank Harris that was governor. But getting them to part with money was extraordinarily difficult. The reason we were able to finance the Democratic National Convention, well, there were a number of reasons. One is we put together a novel structure. It had never been done before, where the Georgia World Congress Center actually became, by contract, the vehicle by which the convention would be financed. That was for a number of reasons. One is it permitted people to give money that would be tax deductible because it was going to a state agency. It permitted us to borrow money because what we did is we went to the 3 or 4 larger banks, back then CNS, First Atlanta, Trust Company. I don't remember if we went to the Bert Lance's old bank of, I want to say Bank of Georgia, but that's not right. But
up in Calhoun, yeah.
No, it was here.
Oh, okay.
National Bank of Georgia. He wasn't there at the time, but he had been the CEO of the National Bank of Georgia. The other thing we did was we passed through the legislature an increase in the Hotel-Motel Tax that would give a revenue stream through the Georgia World Congress Center. The money would go to the World Congress Center. And then by contract, I put together all this matrix. By contract, the World Congress Center would contract with Atlanta '88 to basically be a economic development arm of the state. And the Economic Development Initiative was to put on this convention. Not because it was political, but because it would draw international attention, media from all over the world, and people who would stay in hotel rooms and eat at restaurants and all of the stuff you do, whether it's a football game that they promote. So we created it as an economic development initiative as opposed to a political activity. And frankly, that took a heck of a lot of legal, tax, finance, engineering. When we put the Hotel-Motel Tax in place, there was a sunset clause. It would, at the time, our budget, much smaller than you need today for a convention, but our budget was around $18 million. And we borrowed, I don't know, probably $6 or $8 million up front, secured by the tax revenue, so we could operate. We didn't have any money, so we borrowed it from those banks, and they took security in the tax revenue, Hotel-Motel Tax revenue. But to pacify the hotels, we sunset the tax so that after, I think it would take 3 years to pay off the activities of the convention. We actually paid it off faster, but by the time it was getting ready to sunset, convention was long behind us. We were now looking at building the Georgia Dome. And so we changed the law again to extend the Hotel-Motel Tax to pay the debt service on the Georgia Dome.
Still going through Georgia World Congress Center?
Yeah.
What sort of was Atlanta 88 bipartisan at all, or was it purely a Democratic?
Well, well, the board of Atlanta 88 was not partisan.
Okay.
It had two co-chairs, Andy Young, the mayor, and Bob Holder, who was president at that time of the Metro Atlanta Chamber and ran a huge construction company. Bob was not a Democrat. I mean, I don't know that he was anything, but in his heart, he would have been a Republican. But we put together a board, because this was Atlanta 88 was a tax-exempt enterprise. It could not be partisan. We were not running from Atlanta 88 a partisan enterprise. We were running an economic development enterprise. And you know, I was the counsel to Atlanta 88. I sat in the board meetings and, you know, scripted, if you will, what we did. I think Bobby was the president of Atlanta 88. And as I say, the mayor, Andy Young, was co-chair with Bob Holder. I forget who else was on the board, frankly. But no, that was not, it wasn't intended to be, it wasn't used to be. The function of that enterprise was to put on a big convention in Atlanta. Same sort of thing as, you know, if the Plumbers came to town.
Right. Or the national championship, Super Bowl,
Football
something.
Game. That's exactly right. There
was a lot of speculation that Senator Nunn would jump into the 1988 presidential campaign. Did he put together an early exploratory committee?
No, not a formal one.
Not a formal one. There was an informal one
yes.
with Giffen, Attorney General Griffin Bell, yourself.
Well, there were a lot of people who, really the leading cheerleader was Chuck Robb from Virginia. We had, I think it was 88, at the JJ dinner, Jefferson Jackson dinner. I think it may still be the largest that ever occurred. I don't know if there's a way to research that, but we had over 3,000 people. Today,
that's a big JJ dinner.
Today they have trouble getting 500, I guess. But, and I have to say, I sort of stirred this up. But the principal speaker was Chuck Robb. I can't recall if Robb was still governor of Virginia or whether he'd become senator. I guess he was senator.
He would have been senator because he ran for re-election in '94 against.
he was the most vocal Sam Nunn needs to run for president person. And so we had him be our featured speaker. And basically his speech was Sam Nunn needs to run. It wasn't quite that overt, but it was what the country needs. And maybe this was 87. I don't remember. It might have been 87.
Right.
88 seems a little late, but don't recall the dates. And we had, I think 3,000, 3,500 people in the World Congress Center. And it was quite a, people had, various vendors had buttons made up and bumper stickers about Sam Nunn running for president. But as you know, he never did.
Chuck Robb, Sam Nunn, the Democratic leadership, the DLC, a now defunct organization. I believe it transitioned into something different. I can't recall the name.
Well, they became almost entirely a think tank, public policy institute.
Sort of like a Brookings kind of.
Yeah, less extensive, but yes.
Right. What does the decline or the demise of the DLC and its Republican arm, which was founded, or not arm, but counterpart, founded by Christy Todd Whitman and John Danforth, the sort of center of politics. Maybe this is jumping ahead, but what does it tell us about our the current state of politics, either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, that those sort of center-left, center-right groups seem to, blue dog Democrats in Congress, that caucus has dwindled to a handful of members. What does that tell you?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. First, I want to observe that the DLC over a period of 15 years was an enormous success, right? It was founded with the crazy idea that the initial small band of people could actually drag the Democratic Party from what was then the far left into the, remember, we were San Francisco Democrats. We had a convention in '84 in San Francisco that nominated Walter Mondale, who got beat just about as badly as you could get beat running for president. Among the things he pledged when he was running was to raise taxes. So when Sam Nunn, Dick Gephardt, Chuck Robb, Al Gore, Bill Clinton, and that crowd got together in Sam Nunn's office to talk about trying to moderate the Democratic Party, it sounded like tilting at windmills. And there was a guy by the name of Al Fromm who was in some measure, the genius behind the whole enterprise. And I'd known Al back in the days when I worked in the Senate with Sam Nunn. Al worked for Ed Muskie. That effort succeeded. Bill Clinton's presidency was completely a product of Bill Clinton's talents and preparation and everything, but the agenda developed by the DLC, the moderate agenda. I used to call them an idea factory. I mean, you couldn't just run on personality, you had to have ideas, and Sam Nunn drove that. He became chair of the DLC somewhere around 88-ish, and he was the one that imposed the rigor of thinking and policy with Al Fromm, and delivered policy speeches. I remember one that he gave at a DLC convention in Philadelphia with Jesse Jackson sitting in the front row, and Jesse Jackson was always critical of the DLC because he wanted the Democratic Party to be much farther philosophically to the left. But Nunn intellectually could compel people with the substance of what we had to offer. And he decided, 89-ish, maybe 90, that Bill Clinton should succeed him as chairman of the DLC because Sam Nunn knew I think, didn't articulate it, that ultimately he wouldn't run for president. Thought about it in '88, thought about it somewhat leading into '92, but believed that Bill Clinton was the right messenger, if you will, for this platform. And that's why he turned the leadership of the DLC over to Clinton, so he would have that idea base to run for president on. And if you look at Clinton's presidential campaign, the ideas, not the politics, not the personality, were largely the ideas generated by the DLC. So it was enormously successful. A lot of policies that were adopted during the Clinton years were DLC policies. But by the end of the Clinton years, it had sort of run out of gas. I mean, it was no longer the same debate of left-right at that time. Al Gore was succeeding Bill Clinton as the presidential nominee, and he was out of the same mold. Some things he was a little more aggressive about.
Sure.
Environment, for example.
Right.
But so the need for the DLC really wasn't as acute because the government was the DLC. and of course, governments come and go. Al Gore got beat. There you are. You're back on the outs, and there's no infrastructure. So anyway, that was my argument that in terms of a political movement, the DLC in our lifetimes may be an example of one of the most effective political movements ever created.
Well, I mean, even Barack Obama, although he didn't campaign as a new Democrat or somebody came out of the DLC, governance-wise, he surrounded himself with a lot of alumni from the DLC.
That's right.
Hillary Clinton at state.
That's right. Well, it was hard to get away from us because, we populated the whole place for a while. And so I look back at that whole enterprise as a remarkable period of time where you started with this idea that you could actually affect outcomes. Rarely do you get the chance to, in fact, do that, and we did it.
Your work, you said you got to work with the DNC, the Democratic National Committee. How much work did you have, or how much go between the state Democratic Party organization? Was there any work that you did with the state party?
Oh, yeah, all the time.
What was your assessment of the so-called Georgia Democratic Party as an organization, as a structure, as a political force in the state?
Well, I think during the period that I was actively involved, which really would be the 80s and 90s,
right?
It was quite strong. Had good and strong leadership. Recognized that there was always, during that era, a Democratic governor. A state party tends to be an arm of a governor, if of the same party. And so as a result, it was quite good. And the mayors were all Democrats. The county commissioners, in large part, were Democrats. Statewide elected officials were all Democrats. That started to change even before, governors changed. But, sheriffs were Democrats.
Right.
If you went to Savannah, Columbus, Macon, Augusta, Atlanta, Rome, they were all the mayors were Democrats. So it's pretty easy to have a strong infrastructure if that's the case.
So you ended up chairman of Bill Clinton's primary campaign here in Georgia, and then Clinton Gore.
Yes.
Tell me about that experience. Georgia had been, we just went through that Georgia was a Democratic state at the state, local, county level, but presidential election-wise had been trending away from Democrats since the 60s, with the exception of Jimmy Carter.
Yeah, if you leave out Jimmy Carter, before Bill Clinton, the last Democrat that carried Georgia was Jack Kennedy.
1960.
Well, 1960, Lyndon Johnson from Texas lost Georgia.
So how did you approach the primary campaign? Bill Clinton running as a Southerner, a close friend of Zell Miller's. How did you approach?
Well, actually, a close friend of Sam Nunn's, who integrated him into the Miller relationship.
I did not know that. Is that how that was the dynamic? Was through Sam Nunn, the DLC?
Well, at least the spark of
Okay.
it, yes, because this is my recollection.
Sure.
It may not be
Sure.
totally accurate. Zell Miller really liked Governor Cuomo. We were getting ready to do an event, one of the very first fundraisers for Bill Clinton, we were going to do in Atlanta in December. I want to say December 11th, but for some reason that sticks in my head, but that may be wrong.
And this would have been 91?
91.
Okay.
And I remember going back and forth. I mean, Senator Nunn wanted to do it. He was going to go ahead and do it. And we wanted Governor Miller to be part of it. And Miller was not yet ready to do it. I think Keith Mason was chief of staff, and Keith and I were talking to each other 3 times a day. And Nunn finally said, well, we're just going ahead. Hopefully Zell will decide to join us. And right in that time frame, and I won't have the times exactly right, I recall that a candidate had to personally appear in New Hampshire to register for the New Hampshire primary. And I think it was on a Friday at 11 o'clock was the deadline.
Mm-hmm.
A dear friend of mine had signed on to be political director of the Cuomo for President campaign. I was talking to him that morning because we all thought Cuomo was going to go.
The famous plane on the tarmac.
Literally. And so I'm talking to this pal of mine, and he's telling me, early in the morning, plane's ready to go, everything's on go. And then he calls me up 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning, and he said in his own special way, using a few expletives, that Cuomo wasn't going. And Cuomo announced that day that, he'd rather be governor. That permitted, in a way, Zell Miller to, I think Miller, my impression, don't know this, right? I'm giving you my impression.
Mm-hmm.
I think he was conflicted because he thought a lot of Cuomo. And when Cuomo stepped aside, that caused him to become quite pro-Clinton. And he had helped Clinton, by the way, because I think it was in September, I think it was after the Richard Russell dinner at that time, Zell Miller introduced Bill Clinton to James Carville and Paul Begala, because Clinton didn't have a political consultant, national political consultant. Miller said the best in the business are these 2 guys, meet them. So Miller was pro-Clinton, but it wasn't until Cuomo absolutely got out, as I recall, that he got in it.
The full embrace came.
And once he got in it, he was 100%.
So tell me about campaigning for Bill Clinton in '92. This is Ross Perot is a novel character in that, both in general and in that race. What was it like running a 3-person campaign or overseeing a 3-person campaign? Very unique. back in '92, as we already established the last time a Democratic candidate for president has won the state.
Well, remember, Georgia's primary was on Super Tuesday.
Right.
Bill Clinton lost Iowa, which we expected because Tom Harkin was in the race. You're not going to beat Tom Harkin in Iowa.
No.
Then he lost New Hampshire to Paul Tsongas. Now, I know Carville and he described it as the comeback kid, but he lost. You know, they somehow created this
The expectations
did
game.
better than expected in light of all of the things that had occurred. Remember the Jennifer Flowers press conference, the draft letter. The day after New Hampshire, literally that next morning, we had a rally over at CNN Center. Bill Clinton arrived here the next morning. But what I was going to say is in January, Ed Sims, who was chairman of the Democratic Party, Keith Mason, and I decided that we needed to take Georgia off of Super Tuesday and move it up a week so that we would be the first southern state. Now, that had two reasons. One was all three of us, and Zell Miller and Sam Nunn and Maynard Jackson, Andy, everybody was for Bill Clinton by that time. So we thought it would help Clinton. But we also thought it would make Georgia the center of national attention after New Hampshire. If we were just one of several southern states, you know, so what? If we were the southern state, a week before Super Tuesday, we'd make ourselves central. So Governor Miller signed off, said, let's do this. We had to change the law because the law provided for the date on which the primary would occur. So we're, first week of January of '92, legislature's just coming in, and Max Cleland was Secretary of State. I went and sat down with Max, and he got his staff, and I said, what's our drop dead date? Because, you have to publish, you got to print ballots, you got to have everybody in the field. And he told me what the drop dead date was, that we had to have the law changed in order for him to run an election. So we start the process totally with Governor Miller's support. Without his support, nothing would have happened. But I guess it was Pierre Howard in the Senate and Speaker Murphy signed off on it. So we got it through the legislature in 10 days. Then we had to go to the Justice Department. And because we had to get it pre-cleared.
That's right. That's right.
Back to the Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. So we went to the Justice Department, and remember, this is a Republican Justice Department, but it didn't appear to be, and really wasn't, any kind of a connivance versus the President Bush. It was just the mechanics of how we wanted to run the election in Georgia and make Georgia a centerpiece. So it was sort of bogged down in the Justice Department, and we actually got Newt Gingrich, who was not then Speaker, but was
Whip, I believe he was Whip.
I think it was probably Whip, to poke the Justice Department to move along, because there wasn't any overt negative effort against the
They just
president.
weren't making it their number one priority at that point.
Right. So we got pre-clearance in time to change the election, change the primary. So Georgia was by itself. And we had a rally at Stone Mountain, Sam Nunn, Bill Clinton, Zell Miller. Lots of, Buddy Darden was there.
The delegation.
Yeah, members of Congress, so forth. Monday night before the primary. And after the rally, I'm walking Governor Clinton back to his car, because he was going to leave that night to go to Florida, because Florida was the big state on Super Tuesday, and he planned to be in Florida on the Tuesday, our Tuesday. Super Tuesday wasn't for a week. And as we're walking out, the press stops us, and they ask me as chairman of the campaign, how's he going to do tomorrow? And I said he's going to get 60% of the vote. And they said, well, why would you think that? He hasn't won a primary yet. And there's 3 people in the race, so 60% is hard. I said, it's just my instinct. I believe he's going to get 60% of the vote. Well, press leaves. We continue walking to the car, and the future president of the United States looks at me and says, that was the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And I said, what do you mean? He said, all I got to do is beat the other 2 guys, even if it's 42%. As long as I got more than they do, I win. I said, well, I think it's going to be 60%. He says, there's no chance it's going to be that good. He goes to Florida. Next day's election day. 10 o'clock, the votes are coming in. We're going 58, 61, as votes are coming in. About 10:30, I get this call from Governor Clinton in Florida. And he says, I don't know where it's going to come to rest, but I have to acknowledge you were right. And I've often said on that night I became smart. So it was a big deal because the day after our primary, he went up 10 points in Florida. And
That's a big bounce.
it was a huge bounce. And Super Tuesday became a very successful and experience for him. And it was quite clear to me that if he hadn't won Georgia with a meaningful margin, not just scraped by, that it was probably over. And then the idea that we would carry Georgia in the general election was a pipe dream, right? Because it's not possible for a Democrat to carry Georgia. But the combination of Bill Clinton and Al Gore wasn't just Clinton. 2/3 of it was him, but Al Gore from Tennessee was a good addition. And we did a bus trip across South Georgia. We started in Columbus and ended up in,
Was it Savannah, Valdosta?
No. Central South Georgia. I'm now having a blank. It was only a 1-day bus trip. We didn't go that far. But
Maybe Tifton?
No, we went past Tifton. It was almost at the Florida line.
All I can think of is Valdosta would be down there. Anyway, we can look it up.
Maybe it was Valdosta. It could have been Valdosta. As a matter of fact, I think it was. Anyway, in September, 3rd week of September-ish, we did a South Georgia bus trip. And all along the way, there were literally hundreds of people in southwest Georgia along the road. And he would constantly, made us late the whole day, because he'd stop the buses. And this was a wagon train of buses, because we had the campaign buses, and then we had the national press, and there were tons of national press following him. Well, he'd stop the buses and get out, and he'd talk to the 150 people who were at some crossroads. We were getting way late, and I'm sure now it was Valdosta. We had a big rally scheduled in Valdosta. It was a Monday night. And I became worried that the people who were to come out, we were now like running 2 hours late. That it was a school night, people wouldn't stay. And to have the culminating event in September before the November election in South Georgia be sparsely attended, I really got worried about. So I told the bus driver on the lead bus that he was in, do not stop. I don't care what he says, do not stop. So we're barreling down the road, and we come to another crossroads, and there's a large group of people there, and there's a man with a boy on his shoulders, little boy, who's holding a sign, "Give us 4 minutes and we'll give you 4 years." Clinton gets up, "Stop the bus." I'll never forget that. And as we roll into Valdosta, I see a lot of people walking, and I'm thinking, oh, geez, they're all leaving. And I'm worried about the crowd, and we had a routine that Pierre Howard was with us, along with the governor. Nunn had been with us in Columbus, but didn't do the whole bus ride. He's sort of not a bus guy. And Pierre Howard had a routine that he did that was cute and sort of wasted time. and I had asked him to do that routine because I was afraid that there wasn't going to be much of a crowd and we were going to have to figure out once we got there what we were going to do. And I ran out, got off the bus, and I ran out and I jumped up on the stage to see if I could see what the crowd was like. Well, I got up on the stage and I couldn't see where the crowd ended. It went back beyond the buildings. And so I jumped down and I thought, well, we don't need to have any foolishness on this program because all of the national cameras were there. They were going to put it on the morning shows the next day, like Good Morning America and Today
Right.
and so forth. So I don't need any foolishness. And so I'm searching desperately for Pierre Howard. And then I hear coming across the loudspeakers, Pierre Howard's starting. And I thought, oh, no. So, 'cause at this point, I just want Bill Clinton and Al Gore and the governor. Anyway, we survived all of that. and it was a spectacular event, not just for Georgia, but it was on all of the morning programs the next day and just established, these two young guys, when I think they were 44 and 42, were really captivating people's imagination.
Was it an experience like that gave you confidence that the returns in November would be, if not a win for Clinton, extremely close? Or were you convinced were in the primary?
I was totally uncertain about it. And at that point, Ed Sims, chairman of the party, Keith Mason in the governor's office, and I were talking to each other all day, every day. What do we need to do in Savannah? What are we going to do over here? How do we, do television ads? And we're just nervous about the whole thing. We desperately wanted to carry the state. It became pretty clear nationally that Clinton was going to win by then. By October, the national election looked pretty good for him. The Saturday before the general election, he came to Atlanta to do a rally. And we had a rally in the Decatur High School football stadium. That's the day I knew we were going to win, because we had 30,000 people show up on a football Saturday in Georgia to see Bill Clinton. And I looked at that crowd and said, wow, if we can pull 30,000 people on a Saturday in the fall to see Bill Clinton, we're going to win this thing. And it was a Sam Nunn, Zell Miller, probably Maynard Jackson event with Bill Clinton. And it was a stunningly, you don't do 30,000 people political events in Georgia anymore. They did it in the 40s, in the 30s.
Oh, sure.
But you don't do that anymore. So that was the day that I thought we would pull it off. Now, little did I know, our margin was going to be less than half of the number that was at that stadium. We won by about, 14,000, 15,000 votes.
There's been conjecture by political pundits, some historians, political scientists, that Ross Perot, his presence on the ballot, gave Bill Clinton that margin. What are your feelings? What's your analysis?
I don't know. I mean, my view is that Ross Perot votes were don't elect the incumbent votes. So my view is that those people, if Ross Perot hadn't been on the ballot, either wouldn't have voted or they would have voted for the not George Bush candidate, which would have been us. So I don't buy the Ross Perot threw it to Bill Clinton. I just don't buy it.
How was the 96?
By the way, if he did, that's fine too.
Spoken like a true campaign chairman. How was 96 different, the 96 experience? Because you were also an advisor across the South, or a Southern advisor.
Right. I again chaired the Georgia campaign, but I was sort of engaged as a, I don't know that I had a title, but coordinating the Southern region.
Mm-hmm. Running as an incumbent obviously brings its positives and its challenges. Bill Clinton and the Democrats had a huge setback in '94 during the midterm elections, the defeat of healthcare, Hillary Clinton's healthcare reform package. How did that change the Clinton campaign's approach to re-election? Well, either in the South or beyond.
When you're running for the first time, you don't have a record of governing. You have only aspirations, hopes, and dreams about what could be better. When you've been president for 4 years, you actually have facts. Some people agree with what you did, some people don't. Some good things happen, some not so good things happen. So it's a whole different kettle of fish, if you will. So it's more running on a record. Remember in '92 the theme was basically don't stop thinking about tomorrow. Hope, change, we'll make it better. We had an economic downturn, it's the economy, stupid, that sort of stuff. It's all aspirational and hope oriented. In '96 it was the bridge to the 21st century. We've got to continue the momentum, and it's about the future. We've made progress, but we got to do more. That's not as inspirational as hope and change. And remember also in '92, we had 12 years of 70-year-old presidents. And while we never said anything about George H.W. Bush's age, remember we had a 43 or 44-year-old presidential candidate and a 42-year-old vice presidential candidate. So it was all about the future and changing generations, and that's what the campaign was built on. In '96, that was the status quo. So that's not giving new energy to anything. So it's harder to run for re-election. But I don't think, and we ended up losing Georgia by almost the same margin as we won it the prior year or the prior cycle. But I don't think the national election was ever in question.
Right. You become ambassador to Canada.
In 1995, Bill Clinton made a state visit to Canada. February, I think. 3 weeks before he was going, he called me. I'm sitting in my office on the 50th floor of this building. And he says, I'm taking a state visit to Canada. You grew up in Canada. Why don't you go with me? said, I'd be thrilled to, but I don't know how to do that. And he said, this is easy. I have my own plane. And if you want to come, just get yourself to the White House, that morning when I'm leaving, and we'll handle the rest. So that's what I did. I got to the White House, went up on Air Force One, landed in Ottawa, snow all over the place. But they had a seat for me at every event. The Governor General hosted a lunch, I had a seat. There was a speech on the floor of Parliament where the President spoke to Parliament, I had a seat. There was a state dinner hosted by the Prime Minister at the time. I had a seat at the table next to where the President and the Prime Minister were sitting. I was treated like I was somebody. I'm just a lawyer in Georgia, I'm nobody. But at that dinner, the President went off his speech and he talked a little bit about me. He said, I've got a friend here with me whose life is a metaphor for the relationship between the two countries. I'm paraphrasing now, it's not literally what he said, but he said, he grew up in Canada and he came to the South, and, but he's never given up his study of Canada, and he came back with me as evidence of our cross-border bond. I mean, he made a lot of that up, but the facts were right, but it was good theater. And I'm almost in tears, at that point. My father was born in Canada, about 60 miles from where we were sitting. And so next day we're going back to Washington. I'm in my seat on Air Force One, and the President comes back and he shoos away whoever was sitting next to me, and he sits down and he said, well, what do you think of the visit? And I, again, almost got choked up because it had been a quite meaningful time for me. And I said, it was just spectacular. I don't know how to ever thank you for inviting me to go. And he looked at me and he said, almost offhand, he said, maybe one day you ought to go back there as our ambassador. I'd never thought of that. Truthfully, I didn't know what an ambassador did. But clearly my eyes got big, and he looked at me and he said, you're going nowhere until after I'm reelected. And he got up and he left. He had offered me a couple of jobs in the White House that first term, and I didn't want to move my family to Washington. And after the reelect, we were my wife and daughter and I were at a reception at the White House the day before the inauguration, second inauguration. And he came over to me, and my daughter was standing there. And he said, are you ever going to do anything? And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I've offered you a couple of jobs in the administration. Are you ever going to take one? And I looked at him and I said, if you'll make me ambassador to Canada, I'll do that. And I'm sure he had no recollection.
Did you say that seriously, or was that kind of just?
Well, it was sort of.
Here's my out from this.
I probably said it somewhat tongue-in-cheek.
Okay.
Actually thinking that, wasn't very thoughtful, but thinking that's not a bad idea, but unlikely to ever happen.
Right.
And he just looked at me and he said, I'll get back to you. And one thing led to another, and I became ambassador to Canada.
We could probably sit down and have an entire conversation about your experience as Canadian ambassador. You would have been there 97 to 2001, so that's after NAFTA.
Right.
What was trade and military affairs, sort of the military cooperation between the U.S. and Canada, were those your primary?
Yeah, trade is always a big part of it. Economic exchange between the two countries. Canada and the United States are each other's largest trading partner. It's evolved somewhat since my day, but if you added the whole European Union together, the combined trade, United States with the European Union, was not as large as United States, Canada. For good reason. Canada's right next door, right? And we have manufacturing that goes on that is actually quite integrated. For example, automobiles, part of the cars manufactured in Oshawa, Ontario, and finished in Detroit and vice versa, but that's called trade because it crosses the border. It's really integrated manufacturing in the same neighborhood. There just happens to be a line in between. But managing all of the economic exchange is a big part of the job. But we have law enforcement stuff. We got, a common border where bad guys try and get to one side or the other of the border, and the FBI and the mounted police work together. I mean, back in my day, they're not supposed to do this, but oftentimes the Mounties would try and arrange for the person to be apprehended on the U.S. side of the border because the penalties were stronger, and they wanted strong penalties, right? And our intelligence operations are integrated. Clearly, we work together militarily. Our efforts around the world, when Bill Clinton decided he was going to go into the Balkans to deal with genocide in the Balkans, he needed a NATO country to go with him. The British weren't going to go. The French weren't going to go. The Canadians went. It gave political credibility to what we were doing. We do an awful lot with Canada that you don't see, and you're the intermediary for those conversations.
Were you there when the NORAD treaty was renegotiated?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not sure if it's the NORAD treaty, but the treaty that governs the NORAD
There is
relationship.
a treaty, and there's lore about it in the embassy because I have this saying: if you don't want me to read something, don't give it to me. and so when we were going through that, it was really more of a renewal than it was a renegotiation. It wasn't like this NAFTA experience right now. It was a renewal of the NORAD treaty. But I read it, and I found a typo, on page 50 or something like that. And I called my staff in, and I said, and they looked at me and they said, you got to be the only person who has actually reread the NORAD document. And I said, well, I think we ought to fix the typo. So yeah, and NORAD was a template for a remarkable collaboration. And there's, NAFTA created, in some ways, a misimpression, meaning that somehow the partnership with Mexico was identical to the partnership with Canada because they're both parts of NAFTA, right?
Right.
It's not true. We're part of the same economic agreement. But in terms of national security collaboration, global security, and geopolitical collaboration, the dynamic with Canada is much more integrated and much more special.
Since you brought up NAFTA, how much of the renegotiation of NAFTA, the trade war talk that's emanating from the White House, how much of this is political bluster and how much of it is a substantive move to reevaluate, renegotiate that economic and security partnership?
Well, it's both. The president has the bluster part of the equation. I think he's even acknowledged himself in recent days. He really doesn't understand the details. He's been asserting forever that we have a trade deficit with Canada. We don't. But on the substantive side, Bob Lighthizer, who is the U.S. trade representative, Bob has long-standing philosophical views about trade agreements. I disagree with them. I think they're narrow and I think they're protectionist. But they're grounded in trade theory. They're not uninformed. I just think they're wrong when you deal with a country like Canada, which, as I suggested to you, is an integrated economy with us. It just happens to be a foreign country. And you can't disrupt those supply chains. I mean, quite literally, there are supply chains going on. It's not trading finished products, although that happens too. But a lot of it's agricultural. Pigs will be raised in Iowa and sent to Manitoba for slaughtering, packaged as pork chops, and sent back across the border. And if you start wanting to put duties on that, who are you interfering with? The farmers in Iowa or the slaughterhouses in Manitoba? It's the same pig. So you can't act as if it's trade with Japan or China.
How much cross-border of actual moving human capital is there between people who live in Canada, work in the U.S., live in the U.S.,
Well,
work in Canada?
there's a lot of that.
Is that governed by?
There's for example, there's a tremendous number of Canadian nurses that work in hospitals in Detroit.
Right. Is it York that's right across the?
No, Windsor.
Windsor. Thank you.
Windsor is actually south of Detroit.
That's
geographically south of Detroit. I used to kid about this, the difficulty of getting the man with the wrench across the border. And my example was in Plattsburgh, New York. There is a manufacturing facility owned by Bombardier, which is headquartered in Quebec, right across the border. And that manufacturing facility is to finalize the assembly of subway cars that are sold to the subway in New York City. Because part of the contract with New York City was they'll buy the subway cars from Bombardier, but they've got to be assembled in New York. That's part of the deal. Well, the machines would break down. And the guy with the wrench who knew how to fix the machines was in Quebec. We got to get a visa for the guy with the wrench. This is stupid. We just need the machines fixed and the train cars are going to New York City. You got to be logical about this. One last story I'll tell you is there's a place called Rouse's Point on the U.S. side of the border. The volunteer fire department that serves Rouse's Point comes from the Canadian side of the border. I think it's Valleyfield, but that may be the wrong town. There was a fire in Rouse's Point while I was there. An old historic hotel caught fire. The volunteer fire department on the Canadian side of the border musters. They all, jump in their boots, truck, come up to the border. This is almost like a Disney movie.
Mm-hmm.
At the border, the United States immigration officers ask for their passports. Now, what are the odds that these guys who just jumped in a fire truck have passports? They didn't have passports with them. All of this took such a long time that the hotel burned down. Should we have that kind of difficulty in getting a volunteer fire department across the border? No. When I was growing up as a kid, living in Montreal, we had a cottage in northern New York State. When we crossed the border at a little place called Covey Hill, my dad wouldn't even stop the car. He'd slow down, the immigration officer would come out on the front porch, wave, my dad would wave, and off we'd go. Now, it can't be that simple anymore, but you shouldn't ask for a passport of a volunteer fireman.
So when you came back to Atlanta, how involved were you in politics, or were you trying to get back into your law? You would have been in McKenna Long at...
Well, at that time it was Long, Aldridge, and Norman.
Okay, that's right.
We did the McKenna-Long merger, creating McKenna Long and Aldridge 2 years after I got back.
So how involved were you once you got back in politics? Because this was really the transition period.
Not nearly as involved as I was. Not nearly. I continued to help candidates as I could. I was pretty involved in Roy Barnes' re-election effort, which failed. but beyond that, until Michelle Nunn ran for the Senate, and I chaired her campaign.
Right.
And then I was quite involved in Hillary Clinton's effort. Those two are exceptions. I was intensely involved in Michelle's effort and quite involved in Hillary Clinton's effort. But other than that, I'm not nearly as personally actively engaged.
The Michelle Nunn race in 2014, a lot of high hopes from national Democrats that she, maybe with that legacy name, but also an avowed centrist Democrat. What do you think her campaign, how would you assess her campaign, its strengths, weaknesses, and why maybe she fell short, in which she did outperform Jason Carter, who was running against an incumbent in Nathan Deal.
Not by enough.
Right. I think 47%.
I actually was
Give or take.
I was actually delusional enough to think the two of them would win, and one of the reasons I thought that, certainly they had the heritage, although the heritage was dated. You know, Georgia's a different place than it was when Jimmy Carter was running, and even when Sam Nunn was running. But the heritage was certainly of value. I thought it was the generational thing would make a difference again. That elections should be about the future, and if you can find in this case two, but we're talking about Michelle, a remarkably talented person who is in it not for themselves but to do good. I mean, because she's never done anything other than that. Her whole life pursuit has been helping others. She's clearly bright. She's clearly got enormous integrity, like her father. She's more, like her father, she's more bookish than she is social, which to me, may be a little bit of a impediment as a candidate, but it's a remarkable asset as an office holder. I just thought the dynamic in the time was right. I was clearly wrong. The strengths, Michelle turned into a very talented candidate. She started, as you might expect, as a neophyte. I mean, she had to get her legs under her as a candidate. She'd never done anything like this before. But her genuine desire to help people and do the right thing came through. And she got more comfortable talking about herself, because as a candidate, the commodity you're selling is yourself, and if you're reticent to promote yourself, who's going to? And it took her a little while to get comfortable promoting herself, but she became quite a good candidate. Things happened that fall that unsettled things somewhat. I think it was Ebola or something. People have in their heads that Republicans keep us secure and Democrats don't, and that sort of thing. We went into the fall, went into October, I think, with a real legitimate chance to win, but didn't close the deal.
2 years later, Hillary Clinton, if you didn't watch any of the returns but saw that Hillary Clinton was winning Cobb County, winning Gwinnett County, winning Henry County, the assumption would be that she was going to carry the state. Obviously, that's not what happened. Donald Trump carried Georgia. But what does it say that...
Don't tell me.
I do have to confirm that I can confirm that.
Fake news.
But what does it say that a national Democrat can run and win in a place like Cobb County, which was the epicenter, 80% for Mac Mattingly against Herman Talmadge back in 1980. Gwinnett County, one of the fastest growing counties in the country, that national Democrats can compete and win in those areas, as well as Fulton County, DeKalb County, Decatur, places like that?
Well, your point's good. If you had told me that on election night that she would carry those counties, I would say she was going to carry Georgia. I would have been wrong. So that's another point. In a way, you asked me when I came back, did I get actively involved again? And I said no. One of the things that produces is your instincts aren't informed, right? You can have instincts about politics and government and so forth, but if they're not well informed, and when I came back in 2001, I haven't traveled the state. I haven't been involved actively in helping people run for office, so I don't have informed instincts. I have opinions, but so clearly what was occurring in other parts of the state overwhelmed what was happening in those counties. That said, I think it shows a trend that party won't be as relevant going forward. I mean, as you know, for generations, if you were a Democrat on the ballot, you were likely to get elected. That changed late 1990s, early 2000s. Now it's almost, for the last 15, 18 years, it's been the reverse. I'm not sure that the political philosophy has changed, but the allegiance to party has changed. And by that I mean, I'm not sure that the Georgia legislature is doing things materially different as Republicans than they did as Democrats. It's just their labels have changed, and in some cases it's the same people.
Right.
They,
But Sonny Perdue and Nathan Deal were both Georgia Democrats.
Nathan Deal was Sam Nunn's North Georgia coordinator in 1972 when Sam Nunn ran for the Senate.
I didn't know that.
You know who his South Georgia coordinator was? Saxby Chambliss. Later elected as Republicans, right? So it's this, as I say, it's not only the same philosophy, in some cases it's the same people. So it's more label than it is substance, not in every case. I mean, Democrats writ large have some things they support that Republicans think differently about. But I think it's sort of reverting to the middle where the label is not going to be as controlling going forward as it has been throughout our history. Early on Democrat, now Republican.
So we might be getting to a point where the old saying was, I'm a Georgia Democrat, not a national Democrat, but very well be a Georgia Republican as opposed to whatever's going on in Washington.
But for a period of time, and this is one of the things that I think that happened, for a period of time, you heard an awful lot of people say, I'm a Sam Nunn Democrat. I'm not a national Democrat, I'm a Sam Nunn Democrat. And while Sam Nunn and towards the end of the cycle, Zell Miller were in office, there were prominent, solid Democrats who had a statewide profile that people could associate themselves with, and it was hard to assail that affiliation. Because they knew who Sam Nunn was, they knew who Zell Miller was, they had confidence in who they were, they had confidence in the job they were doing and what they stood for. Those people don't exist today, right? So there's no one to emulate. So the question becomes, when will there be people you can point to and say, I'm just like her, or I'm just like him, unrelated to whether you like D or R, you can count on me to follow their lead. Till we have that, you're not going to see a real change.
Well, it begs the question then, shut out of the governor's mansion since 2003, statewide since 2010. Every elected office statewide is Republican, both senators. What does the path back to either competitiveness or power, what does that look like for Georgia Democrats? If
It looks like a compelling candidate. It's going to take a compelling candidate for governor or senator, primarily governor, because as I said to you before, I mean, governors run the infrastructure.
and Georgia has a very powerful governor.
Well, yeah, I'm not just talking about running the government, I'm talking about running the politics. But they're related in that if you're a county commissioner in Colquitt County, you worry about what the governor thinks because it's going to mean road money. So who a governor is for political purposes in certainly this state, probably most states, although in some states the governor is not as powerful as the Georgia governor, matters. But it matters for running infrastructure. If you have a fundraising dinner that a governor attends, people come. If you have a fundraising dinner that 15 state senators attend, not so much. But the answer isn't necessarily resources. The answer is a compelling candidate. I thought we had two in 2014. We were a little early. And whether 2018 is a year, don't know.
So maybe perhaps a compelling candidate, wave election, and use that as the catalyst, the building block for what used to be the Democratic Party of Georgia.
Right, and there seems to be, you can't tell what's at the core of it, but step by step with elections you see around the country right now, there seems to be some concern about, I would suggest, the White House, and that's affecting people's views down ballot. Whether that has an impact in Georgia this year, don't know.
Well, we'll go ahead and wrap up, but on a less serious note, any chance you can get Justin Trudeau to come down and visit Atlanta?
Probably.
Well, that would I would hazard to guess that would be a very hot ticket.
Probably
in town.
Yeah.
Well, anything else you'd like to add for posterity, Ambassador?
No.
I think we've had a far and wide-ranging discussion.
Yeah, I don't know if it helps what you've been trying to accomplish.
Absolutely it has, and thank you very much, sir.
Delighted.